16-year-old Emma Grayson was arrested for going on a simple evening jog under the authority of a neighborhood HOA hiding. Behind the excuse of safety rules, at the center of it all stood Helen Morton, a woman who used community power like a weapon to silence and control. But what she didn't know was that Emma's father, U.S. Army General Richard Grayson, had fought real battles, and he wasn't about to lose this one on his own doorstep. Just wait until you see how this quiet neighborhood exploded and why justice. In the end, and didn't just knock it, kick the door wide, open, the sun had just dipped below the rooftops of suburban Austin, casting long golden streaks across the cul-de-sac. It was the kind of quiet evening Richard Grayson had been yearning for. Clean. Air, no sirens, no gunfire, no briefings. Just home inside the two-story house he barely recognized after years of absence. He stood at the kitchen sink, rinsing out a coffee mug. The television murmured in the background upstairs. The lights in Emma's room glowed softly. She had left a note saying she was going for a jog around the block just 20 minutes. "Dad clears my head." He smiled that sounded like her, then 3 sharp knocks at the door. Not hesitant, not friendly. They sounded like a summons Richard's. Body reacted before his brain did, decades of military conditioning kicking in. He straightened, instinctively scanning the front porch through the side window before unlocking the door. Standing there were 2 uniformed men in cheap Navy security outfits. Flanking them was a woman in a stiff beige blazer holding a clipboard against her chest like it was a weapon. Her expression was tight, jaw-clenched lips pressed into a permanent line of disapproval. "Mr. Grayson," the woman asked, though it wasn't a question. "Helen Morton, president of the Oak Ridge HOA." Richard nodded slowly, uncertain is something wrong. She didn't blink. "Your daughter, Emma, was seen jogging past 8 HOA. That's a violation of the community's safety curfew ordinance, section 12.4 of the bylaws." Richard stared at her aviolation. "No outdoor movement is permitted after 8 p.m. unless previously authorized," she recited. "Your daughter was advised to stop and return home. She refused. She's being held by our security team." "The police have been notified. You're telling me," Richard said, voice rising, "that my daughter, 16 years old, is being detained. For running, she'll be processed as a minor offender," Helen replied. Crisply unshaken, "The bylaws are very clear." Richard stepped forward, his posture, subtly shifting his height, cast a long shadow. Across the porch. "Let me get this straight," he said, voice lower now, dangerously. "Even you detained my daughter physically for jogging." "We followed protocol," she replied. "Is narrowing, this is not the Army General Grayson. This is a community, and we value structure for a long second." No one spoke. Then behind her, a pair of red and blue lights washed over the driveway. A patrol car rolled. In silently, 2 officers stepped out. "No," Richard said under his breath, but it was already too late. He walked onto the front lawn just in time to see Emma, his daughter, being led out from a nearby HOA outpost, hands behind her back, secured with bright orange. Zip ties here, ye's were wide with disbelief. Her cheeks were flushed not from running but from humiliation. "Dad!" she called out, her voice cracked. I wasn't." Richard started toward her, but one of the officers gently blocked his path. "It's a routine. Juvenile protocol, sir. She'll be processed and released to your custody." "She was running," Richard muttered. "She was running 10 minutes later." The patrol car pulled away. Emma sat in the back seat, silent, staring through the window as her father stood motionless. On the lawn, Thiessen was gone now. The street was quiet again. But inside, Richard Grayson. Something had begun to move. Something heavy, something dangerous. He'd fought enemies on foreign soil, but now in every country he'd served for 30 years. Someone had come for his daughter, and he wasn't going to let that stand. The holding cell was too bright, too cold, too quiet. Emma sat curled in the far corner, her back pressed against the wall. Painted a tired institutional gray, the thin bench they gave her was bolted. The floor and the space smelled like bleached sweat, and something metallic that lingered in the throat. Her knees were pulled to her chest. Zip ties still clung loosely around her wrists, digging red marks into her skin. No one had offered her water. No one told her what would happen next. The only thing she knew was that she was alone. No phone call, no lawyer, no friendly voice explaining why she was here. Just a security officer who processed her with all the warmth of a traffic light. Name Emma violation. HOA Safety Curfew Code 12. 4. What you can explain it to the juvenile intake officer in the morning. They never explained why her neighborhood had its own juvenile intake system or how a homeowners association had power to detain minors without parental consent. The fluorescent lights above buzzed relentlessly, flickering now and then, like they too were tired of being. Here Emma blinked through the tears, not wanting to cry again, but her body betrayed her. She wasn't a criminal. She'd been running, just running the kind of thing. That made her feel okay. That made her feel free. And now she felt like something broken miles away. Richard Grayson paced the length of his living room phone, pressed to his earjaw, clenched so tight it ached. He had called his attorney, no answer, he called. Another and another by 1A. He was on the phone with a state legislator he once served with during a national security task force, you're telling me. The HOA had the legal right to detain my daughter. He growled. The voice on the other end was cautious. Technically, yes, if the HOA. Security is deputized by the county, and if the residents signed on to the bylaws, they operate almost like a private government, and they've been known to push that power pretty far. Richard stared out the window at the perfect rows of homes, identical, roofs and trimmed lawns. It had all looked so peaceful when he moved here, safe, clean, civilized, but now he saw it differently. The signs, the cameras, the neighborhood app full of suspicious activity reports for things like kids loitering and tended scooters. There was no war here, but there was control, and in this suburban peace, his daughter had been taken by Dawn. The call finally came. She'd been released when Richard arrived. At the station, Emma was already sitting on a bench in the lobby. Her hoodie was too big for her small frame. Her eyes, normally so wide and curious, were no-rimmed with red and distant. She didn't speak when he approached, just stood slowly and walked toward him. He opened his arms and she stepped into them, no tears, just silence. Her head rested against his chest. He felt the slight tremble in her shoulders, and he held her tighter. Later, back at home, Emma sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea. She didn't drink. Her wrists still showed faint bruises from the cuffs. Richard couldn't stop staring at them. Something inside him, something old and military and patient, began to wake up, not with shouting, not with rage, with focus, because now it was personal and he wasn't done. The kitchen was silent, not the kind of silence that came from peace or rest, but the brittle kind, the kind that crackled beneath the surface, waiting to break. Only the soft hum of the refrigerator filled the room, steady and oblivious. Richard sat at the head of the table, elbows on the wood, untouched plate in front of him. The scrambled egg had gone cold. Emma sat across from him, legs drawn up on the chair, her oversized hoodie swallowing her frame. Her hair was still damp from the shower, her face pale against the gray morning light. Neither of them spoke. He had brewed her tea. Sether plate placed everything just right, like doing something normal might somehow make any of this feel normal. But the food remained untouched. The mug barely lifted. Emma's eyes stared blankly at the tabletop, tracing the faint rings left by forgotten glasses. It was Richard who finally moved, first a slow exhale. He leaned forward, trying not to look like he was watching her too closely. His voice, when it came, was low, careful. "You want to talk about it?" She shook her head. More silence, and then, without looking up, her voice cracked through it like a fracture in glass. "I was just running, Dad." She paused, her bottom lip trembling. "I didn't do anything wrong." Those words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. There was no drama in how she said them, no yelling, no blame. Just the quiet bewilderment of a teenager trying to understand how her freedom had been redefined overnight. Richard's jaw tensed. He looked at her, really looked, his daughter, the same girl who used to race through puddles in combat boots too big for Her feet when she played army in the yard, the girl who watched him leave for tours with a smile she had to force and welcomed him home with a hug that lingered just a little longer each time. Now she was sitting before him, hurt in a way he couldn't patch. Up, not with duct tape, not with speeches, not with metal. She lowered his gaze to his hands. They were fists, tightly clenched under that edible knuckles white. You kept it together in Kandahar. You kept it together when you lost half your unit in that convoy. Ambush. So hold it now. But this was different. This wasn't battle. This wasn't policy. This was his daughter, at home in a place that was supposed to be safe. He swallowed the fire building in his throat. You didn't do anything wrong, he said. I know. She nodded, faintly, but her eyes stayed down. Richard wanted to rage. He wanted to flip the table, storm down to the HOA office and demand every last one of them look her in the eyes and explain themselves. But instead, he sat still because this wasn't the time for fury. Not yet. This was the time to listen, to watch, to remember, to plan. And as Emma slowly pushed the tea toward the center of the table, her hands shaking just slightly, Richard made a silent promise. This wasn't over. Whoever thought they could humiliate his daughter, strip her of dignity, and call it procedure, they had no idea who they were. Dealing with the sun had barely dipped beyond the horizon when Richard Grayson sat down at his desk in the study. He didn't turn on the overhead light, just the desk lamp, a single cone of warm yellow spilling across paper, a thick binder they'd down in front of him. The Homeowners Association charter and governing bylaws. It looked innocuous. Enough plastic tabs legal-sized. Paper printed in Comic Sounds, but he wasn't fooled. He'd seen this type of document before. Not in suburban homes, but in war zones, where private contractors and shadow agencies cloaked power under paper. He knew how systems hid weapons, in language. And so he began, page after page. His eyes tracked every word with ass-snipers. Precision he circled in red druwaros scribbled in the margins. The silence of the house was total, broken, only by the occasional snap of a page being flipped or the low growl of his voice reading clauses under his breath. Section 12. 4 residents are expected to abide by community curfews as determined by the Board of Safety and Ordnance. No time stamp, no vote, no cited state law. That was the first flag he kept reading. Enforcement procedures that allowed private security personnel to detain minors for community endangering behavior. Undefined. Clause 7. 9. Mentioned emergency powers given to the HOA president in case of elevated neighborhood risk, but no process to determine what that meant. Disciplinary measures included temporary detainment for processing no again, with no mention of police oversight. And worst of all, a complete lack of documentation on any resident votes or community approvals for these policies. Richard sat back in his chair. For a moment, pens still in hand, he had faced enemy plans in Arabic, Farsi, and Russian. This was written in a different code. American legal ambiguity, but the goal was the same. Confuse, conceal, and control. His daughter had been arrested for jogging. But what he saw now, it was systemic, calculated, bigger than Emma. He opened his laptop. There were people he hadn't called in years. Journalists had briefed off the record during Pentagon consultations. Civil rights attorneys wooed him favors. One in particular, Mara Zegler, constitutional lawyer, sharp as a scalpel and twice as deadly in court, had her number in too. The burner phone had kept in the back of his safe, an old habit he never quite let go of. She answered on the second ring. "Grayson, it's me. What's going on?" He paused, eyes on the chaotic mess of documents spread across his desk. "Look into this HOA," he said. "Calm but firm, Oak Ridge District, outside Austin. There's more here than a curfew violation." A beat of silence. Then Mara's voice shifted, more focused, intrigued. "You found something, not something." Richard said, "A blueprint for private tyranny." By the time the clock struck midnight, his desk was covered in notes, highlighted pages, printed screenshots, and 2 open law books. The calm intensity in his face hadn't wavered. Once he wasn't angry. Anymore, he was preparing. And when Richard Grayson prepared for battle, Whether across the ocean or across a cul-de-sac, he didn't stop until the enemy fell. It started with one tweet a local reporter named Janelle Cruz, who'd covered HOA corruption cases before, posted the headline with a clipped summary and a photo of Emma, in running gear, Army General's daughter detained by HOA security for jogging at 8:15 p. MU read that right then. CNN picked it up, then the Washington Post, then TikTok, exploded by morning. The headlines stretched across national media: Army General's daughter arrested by HOA for jogging abuse of power in Texas suburb. The image of Emma, tall, tired, bruised wrists barely hidden under the sleeves of her hoodie, circulated across every platform. People were stunned, outraged, curious. The hashtags came. Quickly, let her run. #Ho overreach, #free Emma. What had started as an obscure neighborhood incident had now become a national debate. Inside Oak Ridge, the walls began to crack at first. It was cautious murmurs, then phone calls, then anonymous posts on neighborhood forums. My 14-year-old got a $150 fine for leaving his scooter near the curb. We were threatened with eviction for painting our mailbox without prior pallet approval. I was told I couldn't put up a Halloween decoration because it violated aesthetic unity. Stories poured in. It wasn't just Emma. She had just been the spark. By the second evening, the sidewalk in front of the HOA office wasn't empty anymore. Parents, veterans, high school students, a few news vans. People held up signs. HOA police, my kid, my rules. This isn't a gated community. It's a prison. One man brought a fold-out chair and sat silently, holding a photo of his wife. She had been fined repeatedly for putting potted plants on the porch steps, and the stress had contributed to a heart attack. Last spring, others brought their children, who chalked the sidewalks with his words, "Freedom means running too," and Richard has stood at the edge of the gathering, arms crossed, watching it all unfold. Not with ego, but with calm observation. This wasn't just about his daughter anymore. This was a pressure valve finally hissing open. That night at the local community center, cameras flashed as Richard stepped up to a small podium. A crowd had gathered inside: reporters, neighbors, a few people from neighboring counties who had driven in just to witness it. He looked over the room, clear-cleed, his throat, and began. "I served this country for 30 years. I've stood on foreign soil under foreign fire, protecting the values we all say we believe in, but never, not once, did. I imagine I'd have to come home and defend my daughter's right to jog on a sidewalk. This isn't about bylaws. This is about control disguised as community. It's about fear dressed up as order. A pause, and we're not afraid anymore." Applause broke out, not loud or staged, but earned-like, a long breath finally exhaled by the end of the night. 3 HOA board members had resigned. The president, Helen Morton, had gone silent. And the governor's office released a statement that they were looking into the legal boundaries of private HOA enforcement. Hope wasn't just growing, it had a voice now, a pulse, a name. And Richard Grayson stood at the center of it, not as a general, not as a politician, but as a father. Days after the protest, Richard received a letter. Thick cardstock, HOA seal, Austin gold, inside a cease and desist order: cease further public statements. That damaged the reputation of the Oak Ridge HOA, subject to legal action for defamation, incitement, and disorderly conduct. Richard read it once, no emotion, no surprise, just confirmation. He folded it calmly and laid it aside. They were escalating. The HOA wasn't backing down. Helen Morton, now a regular on local news, doubled down in every interview. This is about safety, not control. We enforce the rules residents agreed to. Behind her polished words, enforcement quietly ramped up. Protesters received warnings. For unauthorized gatherings, residents who spoke out found citations taped to their doors: trash bins too far from the curb, grass too long, porch lights too bright. A mother who attended thoroughly got a notice. Her garden violated aesthetic cohesion. It was intimidation dressed in policy, but Richard Grayson didn't rattle. He documented everything, passed reports to journalists, fed them to Marlo Ziegler's legal team, and waited. This wasn't panic. This was preparation. He knew this dance he'd seen dictatorstry. It came with clipboards and passive-aggressive emails one night. A dark SUV circled the block 3 times, no place, no lights. Richard watched from his study window, still silent. They want to scare me, he thought, let them by morning another. Letter arrived, an accusation that Richard was coordinating civil unrest and threatening his property rights. He opened a blank file on his laptop, titled it Public Statement. The war on community, because Helen Morton had drawn a line and Richard Grayson was stepping over it. The community center had never seen so many people. By the time the emergency town hall began, every chair was taken, the back wall was lined with veterans and faded jackets. Parents with folded arms, high school students gripping handwritten signs, journalists with press badges took notes near the exits. Even 2 national networks sent cameras at the front. The HOA board sat behind a long plastic table, suits tight, smiles no warmth. Helen Morton sat in the center, eyes, narrowed hands, folded, on the table like a judge waiting to rule. But this time the gavel wasn't hers. The microphone stood in the aisle one by one. People came forward. First, a young father stepped up. Last year, I got a $250 fine because my 3-year-old left sidewalk chalk. Drawings outside defacement, they called it then. An elderly couple, we were fined weekly for flying a U.S. flag off our porch. They said it disrupted visual unity. We served in Vietnam. Next, a trembling teenage girl, maybe 15. Her voice shook. They took my bike. Because I left it near a fire hydrant, I begged them to let me move it. They said the decision was final. She wiped tears. The room went quiet. What began as Emma's story had become something larger. A floodgate had burst, and the board they sat in. Stony silence. No apologies, no answers, just silence. Richard Grayson sat and in the front row, listening, watching, measuring. Then he stood the room, fell even quieter. He stepped up to the podium, no papers. No teleprompter, just his voice, steady, controlled, precise. I've served this country my whole life. I've stood in uniform in places where freedom is only a word whispered, feared, or forgotten. I never thought I'd come home and see the same fear of my daughter's eyes. Because she went for a jog, he looked directly at Helen Morton. This is not a dictatorship. It's a neighborhood, and I will not let it become a prison silence. Then, applause. At first, light, respectful, and then louder, unified the sound of a crowd finding. Its courage. A vote was called. It wasn't close. Helen Morton was removed from her post. 3 other board members resigned on the spot. The HOA's curfew policies were repealed, effective immediately, and a formal investigation was launched into the HOAs. Legal overreach and enforcement practice. No shouting, no chaos, just order, but real, democratic earned order for the first time in years. People walked out of the Oak Ridge Community Center, not afraid. Not quiet. Hope wasn't a whisper anymore. It had become a voice. The streetlights flickered on one by one, casting long shadows across the quiet lanes. Of Oak Ridge, the evening air was still warm, tinged with the scent of freshly cut grass and distant rain clouds. It was exactly 8:15 p.m. The same time, the same sidewalk, Emma Grayson stood at the edge of her driveway, lacing up her running shoes. The same ones she wore that night, her hoodie sleeves rolled up to the elbows, her hair tied back in a simple ponytail. Her fingers trembled, not from fear but from something else, something bigger, anticipation behind her. The door creaked up. And go on, Richard said gently, his voice softer than usual. Emma turned, gave him a nod, and stepped forward. But she wasn't alone. As she reached the sidewalk, another pair of footsteps joined hers, then another and another. By the time she hit the corner, more than 70 people had gathered beside her. Some were in sneakers, others in flip-flops. A few parents pushed strollers, gently rocking. Sleepy toddlers, 2 veterans, moved slowly but proudly in wheelchairs. High schoolers jogged in loose packs, laughing under their breath, and just behind them, reporters with shoulder cameras followed, not to chase a headline but to witness something rare. No one spoke. No one needed to. Their feet tapped softly against the pavement. The rhythm almost meditative, a silent parade, a quiet stand-a, moving answer from behind. Curtained windows, others watched some. Curious, some tearful, some finally understanding. It wasn't a protest. It wasn't. A rebellion? It was freedom in motion. The freedom to exist, to breathe, to run, not by permission, not by ordinance, but by right. Richard stood on the porch, arms crossed, loosely watching as his daughter disappeared down the road surrounded by the people she had unknowingly inspired. His chest rose with a slow, steady breath. He didn't smile. Not quite, but in his eyes a peace he hadn't known in years. Because battles end in many ways. Some with surrender, some with treaties, and some with the sound of footsteps. In the dark, things were different now. The signs came slowly, almost imperceptibly. At first, but they were real. And lasting, the Oak Ridge HOA, once feared like a silent enforcer, was now a body of neighbors, no trullers. The board had been restructured. Helen. Morton, long gone from her post, had disappeared from public view. In her place came new voices, younger, older, quieter, fairer. A new charter was drafted line by line. Residents could vote on curfews, enforcement power was stripped from private security, and returned to local law enforcement, with clear oversight language was revised, control was replaced with cooperation, regulation with responsibility. And for the first time in years, people smiled at each other on the sidewalk, not out of habit, but because they meant it on a warm Sunday evening. Richard Grayson stood at the edge of his lawn, hands in his pockets, watching the street breathe again. Children raced each other between driveways. An older couple walked hand in hand beneath the soft spill of the setting sun, and up ahead, Emma jogged with three of her friends, laughing, really laughing, her voice carrying down the block like it had when she was little. Richard didn't call after her. He didn't need to. He just stood there taking it in. This battle hadn't left. Scars like the ones he knew from the battlefield, no smoke, no ash, no flag storm from bunkers, but it had demanded the same strength, the same clarity, the same refusal to back down, because the enemy this time had worn no uniform. It had crept in through rules and silence, through good order and community standards, through fear passed off a structure. He looked up at the sky, the last hints of daylight fading. Sometimes he thought the greatest enemy isn't a foreign army, it's the silence we let settle around. Us, the kind that tells us to sit down, stay quiet, follow blindly, and he made a promise to. Himself the kind that didn't need a ceremony or a medal. Silence would never again be his family's prison, not while he had breath in his chest. Later that night, Emma slipped back inside, flushed from her jog and full of stories. She hugged her dad before heading upstairs the way she used to. Noward's just comfort, and Richard sat back in his chair, finally fully at peace, because freedom isn't loud, it isn't always won. With bullets or banners, sometimes it's won with voices and the courage to use them.